So, how does the Earth's life change over time? Okay, here we're dealing with the process of evolution. Okay, and that evolution we're dealing with that change over time. And basically, we're talking about with evolution, we're talking about biological evolution. So it's basically the process where Earth's life changes over time through changes in the genetic characteristics of populations. Okay, that really is the most important part. It's a genetic change in populations from generations before, multiple generations before. And the theory of evolution says that all species that are present now descended from earlier ancestral species. In other words, the main thing to remember is that life comes from life. So the Earth's life changes over time. It's been around since the early Greek philosophers, Charles Darwin, Alfred Wallace. They both independently proposed the concept of natural selection as a mechanism for biological evolution, which we'll get into here in a minute, but it was Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. And really what they observed was that individual organisms are going to struggle constantly to survive. They're going to have to survive by getting enough food, by getting enough water, other resources to avoid being eaten or dying off. And in order for them to survive, they're going to survive and then reproduce and produce offspring. Okay, individuals with advantages over others in a population are going to be more likely to survive, and they're going to be more likely to produce offspring. So if they have certain traits that allow them to survive and reproduce offspring, then those offspring that are produced will have those traits as well. So here's an example of natural selection. So what we're looking at here is a diagram that's in your book on page 87. In part A, what we're looking at is just basically the evolution of bacteria. So what you have is you've got these normal bacteria that are highlighted in red, and you've got bacteria that are resistant to a certain form of antibiotic. So the normal bacteria wind up getting killed off by the antibiotic, but the resistant ones stick around. Okay, so in part A here, we've got a population of bacteria exposed to an antibiotic, moves into part B, it kills all the individuals except those that have the trait that allow them to be resistant to that antibiotic. Move into C, those resistant bacteria wind up multiplying, and then they eventually replace most or all or most of the original bacteria. So what we're looking at here is going from here down, is we're looking at a population here where just a couple of select individuals have the genetic traits necessary to survive. All the other ones here, okay, and so forth, they wind up being killed off by an environmental change or an environmental factor or something that took place in their ecosystem. So these guys are the ones that wind up surviving. And notice as we go to these next generations, you're seeing a greater number of the blue bacteria, the ones that are resistant, that have survived and have produced offspring, and those offspring have the same traits as those ancestors. That right there is evolution by natural selection. The thing you have to remember about this is it is a genetic change. I use triangle delta for change. It's a genetic change. Okay, it's not something that, let's say, somebody alters their muscle structure by being a workout fiend. Okay, what they've done is they've improved their physical characteristics. That is not something that is genetic. If that person, and let's say, finds a mate that also has enhanced their physicality through working out, things like that, genetic change has not taken place. Okay, if they were to have offspring, those offspring would not automatically have that rebuilt enhanced muscular structure. It's not a genetic change. In order for evolution to take place, evolution by natural selection has to be a genetic change. All right, so let's talk about humans becoming such a powerful species. This is the case study that is found here on page 87. Like a lot of other species, humans have survived and thrived because we do have certain traits that allow us to adapt and modify parts of our environment to increase our survival chances. Three adaptations are really the ones that stand out. Strong opposable thumbs. That's number one. Okay, it allows us to grip and use tools better than the few other animals that have thumbs could do so. Two, the ability to walk upright. Okay, it gave us agility. It freed up our hands for many uses. And then three, and probably the most important thing, is our complex brain. It's these three traits. The brain allowed us to develop lots of skills, including using speech to transmit complex ideas. These three things together have helped us to develop tools, weapons, protective devices, technologies, and basically these things right here, especially the complex brain, when you think about all the technologies that have been created, it's basically been so that we could enhance our senses. Our sight, our hearing, our smell. It makes up for some of our deficiencies. I mean, you think about some of the advances that have taken place in the study of the universe. We would never know what the sun is made of. We would never know what we were looking at in the nighttime sky if we didn't use our complex brain to be able to develop technologies for us to be able to see those things. So we use these things to basically enhance our senses, sight, hearing, smell, touch, etc. And basically what you need to think about in terms of the human species is really, really unique because we're dealing with just a small, really minuscule portion of the 3.5 billion year history of life on Earth. We have basically developed technology that has allowed us to take over most of the Earth's net primary productivity for our own use. So by doing so, we've kind of taken it over, but then also we've increased our opportunities and chances for degradation. So the powerful species that the human species has become is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, environmentally speaking. One caveat, one thing to keep in mind, is that adaptations that make a species successful during one period of time might not be enough to allow it to survive over a longer period of time. So environmental conditions could wind up occurring to where we have such a rapid change that the human species might not be able to adapt as quickly in order to enhance its survival. However, this thing right here, this complex brain, okay, that right there could certainly help when it comes to having to develop new technologies, new strategies for survival in an ever-changing environmental situation. All right, so limits to adaptation through natural selection. Okay, it does have its limits. Okay, some things, limitations. Bacteria, like we saw before, bacteria develop a resistance to antibiotics. But there are three things, actually two things that really limit adaptation through natural selection. The first thing is that a change in environmental conditions can lead to an adaptation only for genetic traits that are already present in a population's gene pool, okay? Or for traits resulting from mutations which occur randomly. So the limit is if an environmental change takes place, so there's our change, basically what it'll lead to is it'll lead to a selection for a pre-existing trait, okay? the change will not cause a mutation. What will happen is the change could wind up being so severe that there's only a very small proportion of the population that winds up having this pre-existing trait, and they may not be able to reproduce enough to be able to extend their species, to be able to produce offspring that wind up having those traits. And then secondly, basically I kind of touched on it there, it's reproductive capacity. So it's all well and good if a species or a portion of a species has that pre-existing trait to be able to pass it down, but the ability of a population to adapt is going to be limited by its reproductive capacity. For example, there are lots of genetically diverse species like weeds, mosquitoes, rats, cockroaches that are out there. They can adapt to a change in a really, really short period of time. And they can actually pass that stuff down very quickly because those species reproduce very quickly and in mass numbers. However, species that don't produce large numbers of offspring quickly, like elephants, tigers, humans, sharks, okay, they'll take a much longer time to be able to adapt through natural selection, hundreds of thousands or even millions of years to be able to adapt. And then finally, the common myths about evolution through natural selection. Here there are three. Basically, the first one is survival of the fittest means survival of the strongest. Okay, that is a myth. Okay, so just because something may be strong doesn't necessarily mean it is the most fit to survive. Fitness is a measure of reproductive success. Okay, so really when you're talking about a fit species, okay, fit is going to be equal to reproductive success. The perfect example to think about here is the cockroach. Okay, the cockroach is really, really fit in terms of its adaptiveness. Okay, so fitness is reproductive success, not strong. Cockroaches aren't necessarily strong species, but because they can reproduce quickly, they reproduce in very large numbers, they have reproductive success. The second myth is that organisms develop certain traits because they need them. Okay, this really isn't the case. It's organisms have these traits, and the ones that wind up survive because they already have those traits as a pre-existing trait. Okay, so it's not a matter of need. Okay, it's a matter of what traits does an organism have that allows them to survive and be able to produce offspring that have those same traits so that they can in turn survive. And then finally, the third myth that your text discusses is evolution by natural selection involves some sort of grand plan of nature where species become more perfectly adapted. Okay, so the grand plan evolution myth. Okay, basically there's really no plan or a goal for genetic perfection. Basically, it's a response to an environmental change, and the species that are most adapted to survive that change reproduce and produce offspring that also have that trait, also have that adaptation. That is evolution through natural selection. So natural selection right here basically is you have an environmental change, okay? You've got traits, and those traits then survive and then reproduce, okay? Or the organisms with traits wind up surviving and reproducing so that the offspring wind up having the same traits that the parents had in order to be able to survive that environmental change.